Hi, my name is Peyton Brooks, and I am a senior in the McConnell Scholars Program, and today I have the privilege of introducing Miss Grace Olmstead. Grace Olmstead is a journalist and author of Uprooted: Recovering the Legacy of the Places We Left Behind, a graduate of Patrick Henry College with a degree in journalism. Her writing has been published in the American Conservative, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and others. Grace's work focuses on the intersections of family, localism, and agriculture, and how these intersections impact our perceptions and outlooks on life. She has been influenced not only by her experiences growing up in rural Idaho, but also by her notable writers such as Kentucky's own Wendell Berry. With her book Uprooted, Grace has proven to be a notable writer on the American experience and rural life. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce her to you all this evening. Please join me in welcoming Miss Grace Olmstead.
Thank you so much for letting me join you all. It is such a delight to get to be back. I have loved every time I've gotten to come to this campus and to talk with people about important ideas and about issues that matter to all of us. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that this evening as we look at democracy in America. So I have a little introduction that I've prepared. Hopefully it won't be too long and boring. But this lecture in particular is considering Tocqueville's conception of the township in Volume 1, Chapter 5 of Democracy in America, focusing particularly on the virtues that Tocqueville identified in civic involvement and in ideas of local activism. As Aristotle argues in his work on politics that the polis is essential to human flourishing, Tocqueville suggests that the township is, in fact, indispensable to the life and well-being of the citizen. It is important to emphasize the stakes, kind of as we start this discussion, the stakes of Tocqueville's position here. Without strong townships, he argues, we forget what it means to be good citizens. Self-governance starts at home. So 3 particularly valuable threads stand out as we consider Tocqueville's vision of place. The township, Tocqueville suggests, serves to encourage prudence, to encourage neighborliness, and to encourage a spirit of ownership. But I would also like to add, if the township can encourage indispensable virtues, it's also true that it might nurture vicious and unjust habits, ones that are deleterious to the health of its communities. And so in the latter half of this lecture or introduction, I want to consider the vices of the township as well. But we have to start with a simple question. What is the township? How does Tocqueville define it? How does he understand it? The word that Tocqueville uses for the American township is the French word commune, which refers to a small municipality or town. The word captures an understanding of townships as places in which life is held in common, in which there's a sense of membership and shared rapport. Aristotle begins his politics, as I said, with the polis, with the city. The city was, in Aristotle's opinion, the telos, or the aim of human life. Humans, he famously wrote, are social or political animals. We can only be happy and virtuous when we are living in community with each other. Families are not enough, individuals are not enough. Whereas Aristotle started with the polis, Tocqueville begins democracy in America with the township. But the 2 terms and ideas are not dissimilar. Like Aristotle, Tocqueville argues that the township always comes first. It is in fact prior, as small townships serve as the germ for all other forms of political association. So township society, he writes, quote, exists among all peoples, whatever their usages and their laws may be. It is man who makes kingdoms and creates republics. The township appears to issue directly from the hands of God. Importantly then, Tocqueville's township is not a distinctively democratic political entity. It is a distinctively human entity. The township can take many shapes and forms, the medieval village as well as the modern municipality. Its political structure will vary according to its context, its culture, and its populace. What unites and defines the township is not its political structure per se, but its people and its mores. At risk of repeating material that you guys have already covered in past seminars, I thought it would be worth just considering again the word moray at this juncture because it matters so deeply to Tocqueville's discussion of the township, and it continues to be an important word throughout the entire book. Translated from the French, Tocqueville understands the moray to be the whole moral and intellectual state of a people. Mores are habits of the mind and heart which shape human character and community. While laws can also help to shape our communities, Tocqueville argues, in fact, quote, that mores do more than laws. Our habits make us who we are, influencing both sentiment and action. They reflect the ideas and beliefs that we act upon on a day-to-day basis. In the American context, it is because of mores that the township serves as the animating heart of democratic life. Because of their deeply embedded and embodied nature, we practice our mores day after day. They are as much local as they are national. At the very beginning of Volume 1, in Chapter 2, Tocqueville suggests that England's 13 colonies inherited ideas of township government and free local institutions from long-standing English habit, which spread from Great Britain to North America. In England, ancient traditions of monarchy and aristocracy would seem to us to hamper free institutions or home rule. This is kind of an interesting idea, but the fact that they were such steady and vital habits in Great Britain only serves to affirm Tocqueville's suggestion that mores grow in and through the lives of localities, of townships. In America, therefore, Tocqueville suggests that the township was organized before the county before the state before the union, and that from the very beginning, because of the Puritans' mores, their organization was intentionally democratic. That humble beginning empowered communities to preserve and promote local sovereignty. That empowerment, in turn, shaped the mores and habits of American communities in all the decades to follow. It is important to note, I think, that Tocqueville draws a sharp contrast between New England colonies and Southern colonies, in large part because of their differing telos or purpose when they were formed. Communities in Virginia and other Southern colonies did not necessarily seek local sovereignty or freedom of conscience as they were beginning. They began in a quest for gold and persisted in the pursuit of agricultural wealth. Again, the township is not so much an inherently virtuous political entity as it is a potent microcosm of human habit, belief, and community. In the South, Tocqueville seems to suggest that democratic feeling and home rule were often diluted by the presence of slavery and its inherent injustices. He writes, quote, "No noble thought, no immaterial scheme presided at the foundation of the new Virginia settlements. Hardly had the colony been created when they introduced slavery. That was the capital fact that was bound to exert an immense influence on the character, the laws, and the whole future of the South." This distinction is important. It suggests that Tocqueville does not praise the idea of townships qua townships, but rather he is drawing the reader's imagination toward a specific iteration or impulse of the American township. As local governance grew throughout New England specifically, Tocqueville suggests that these communities promoted and sustained and maintained various virtues, 3 in particular that I would like for us to consider. So the first vital habit of the local township is that of prudence. Prudence, or phronesis to the Greeks, is the virtue of practical wisdom. It is a wisdom that enables us as citizens to do the right and good thing in our own immediate context. We may have high aspirations to just action and shrewd political involvement. We may have lots of intellectual knowledge and know-how regarding the good life, social justice, and political activism. But if we do not or cannot apply this knowledge rightly in our own geographic and socio-political context, we do not have prudence. Prudence contains a particularizing instinct that enables us to live rightly in one place. It emphasizes the fact that we do not live anywhere, we live somewhere, and we have particular responsibilities in our unique somewheres. In his book, After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre suggests that the exercise of the virtues requires a capacity to judge and to do the right thing in the right place, at the right time, in the right way. No easy task. Prudence is the intellectual virtue that enables us as humans to determine what that thing is and when to do it and how to do it. And Tocqueville suggests that healthy, virtuous townships teach their citizens this sort of prudence through regular habits of civic participation. Citizens learn prudence by determining when and how a school ought to be built or a road ought to be repaved. Citizens grow in wisdom by voting for political candidates, attending town meetings, and running for local office. But it is Tocqueville's example of serving on a jury that I think most fully explains why and how home rule builds prudence. Quote, "The jury, and above all the civil jury, serves to give to the minds of all citizens a part of the habits of the mind of the judge, and these habits are precisely those that best prepare the people to be free. It spreads to all classes respect for the thing judged and the idea of right. Remove these two things, and love of independence will be no more than a destructive passion. It teaches men the practice of equity. Each, in judging his neighbor, thinks that he could be judged in his turn. The jury teaches each man not to recoil before the responsibility of his own acts. In forcing men to occupy themselves with something other than their own affairs, it combats individual selfishness, which is like the blight of societies. Through opportunities like jury duty, as much as we often dislike it, just opportunities such as this to exercise prudent leadership, the township's political institutions actually educate and inform its citizenry, helping each citizen learn how to act rightly, to do justly, and to love mercy. By making each local townsperson a governor of sorts of their place, the township teaches each what it means to govern well. Local democratic politics thus offers a lifetime education in what it means to be free. The implications for state and national governance should be somewhat obvious. We start by loving our hometowns, but we should never stop there. We should not neglect to vote for senators, for representatives, or for presidents just because we are regularly voting for our town's mayors and council members. The ironic, even tragic thing is that in our own day and age, we tend to ignore the latter altogether and to focus only on the former. Tocqueville suggests that the prudent voter should care first about their town council members and their mayor, and then begin to consider the workings of state and national politics. So it is not that Tocqueville is opposed to a strong national government necessarily, or a nationally focused citizenry. Indeed, he suggests that townships, if they are to persist and survive, must, quote, have reached their fullest development and be mingled with national ideas and habits. The growth of social capital and vibrant civil associations depends on a certain degree of reciprocity between the nation and the locality. The township must relate actively, must mingle, as he puts it, with national ideas and habits. As they educate their citizenry and cultivate prudence, local communities contribute to the life and well-being of democracy as a whole. National governmental entities, in their turn, have a responsibility to the well-being of their townships and play an important role in promoting and safeguarding the justice, freedom, and well-being each township needs. So Tocqueville does not reject all forms of national political action in regards to the township, but he does warn against forms of administrative centralization that would refuse to preserve the particularity of place or that would seek to supplant the independence of the township. Bureaucratic centralization, he suggests, keeps townships from finding their own ways to solve problems and hampers them from shaping local solutions. Administrative centralization, put simply, can be detrimental to that growth in prudence that is supposed to be formed at the local level. The more a township is empowered to organize, to problem solve, and to exercise home rule, the more likely it is to build particularized solutions to social needs, or at least that's how the thinking goes. Tocqueville is critical, therefore, of certain forms of political centralization. Yet a lack of administrative centralization also has consequences, and you'll see that he owns up to that and talks about that quite a bit in the latter part of your reading in his chapter on centralization. He himself suggests that society will function less smoothly without it. How Tocqueville's words apply to our own time is, I think, a very interesting and important conundrum. The administrative centralization of the federal government throughout the 20th and 21st centuries is indisputable. And we don't really want to imagine a nation without Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. But could it be that federal oversight of certain tangible human needs can weaken either our propensity or our desire or our opportunity to care for our neighbors? This matters, if so, because the second vital component of Tocqueville's vision of healthy townships is the virtue of neighborliness. Tocqueville is deeply concerned throughout this entire book with American individualism, with our tendency to isolate ourselves, to care only for our own interests, and to abandon the civic work of democracy for our own enrichment and pleasure. He suggests later on in Democracy in America that Americans are, quote, in the habit of always considering themselves in isolation, and they willingly fancy that their whole destiny is in their own hands. Isolation of this nature, he adds, is the ultimate weapon of despotism. But if and when citizens are, quote, forced to be occupied with public affairs, Tocqueville writes that they are necessarily drawn from the midst of their individual interests and from time to time torn away from the sight of themselves. From the moment when common affairs are treated in common, each man perceives he is not as independent of those like him as he at first fancied, and that to obtain their support he must often lend them his cooperation, end quote. So we need each other. Individualism can be toxic, Tocqueville writes, because of the way it encourages us to ignore the needs of our neighbors. We are tempted not to care, but the prudential and particular nature of local politics does not allow for that sort of apathy, as he describes at length here. Quote, only with difficulty does one draw a man out of himself to interest him in the destiny of the whole state, because he understands poorly the influence that the destiny of the state can exert on his lot. By charging citizens with the administration of small affairs, much more than by leaving the government of great ones to them, one interests them in the public good and makes them see the need they constantly have for one another. Local freedoms, which make many citizens put value on the affections of their neighbors and those close to them, therefore constantly bring men closer to one another, despite the instincts that separate them, and force them to aid each other. If this is true, the removal of local forms of indebtedness and care, their replacement with a more nationalized or distant bureaucracy, could present an important challenge for the mores of the township, and it would be important to consider what measures, whether political or social, might bolster those mores in our own time. But as we consider and talk about local township and home rule, it is important to ask, what about the flaws and vices of local associations and townships? Why doesn't Tocqueville talk more about these? To praise the original inhabitants of Plymouth, as Tocqueville does at the beginning of Volume 1, may suggest that we are refusing to acknowledge the Wampanoag communities they stole from, or the role the Pilgrims' grandchildren played in killing and enslaving indigenous peoples during King Philip's War. Brown University research has suggested that between 1492 and 1900, an estimated 2 million to 5.5 million indigenous people were summarily taken from their ancestral homelands and forced into slavery. This celebration of home rule and local initiative may also suggest that we are ignoring the injustices of the Salem witch trials, which display the rampant injustices of mob rule in a township. In another section of our reading, Tocqueville lauds the fact that local townspeople in one community, he observed, tracked down a local criminal and brought him to justice without recourse to the police or criminal justice system. But what of the brutality of townships' demeanor toward escaped slaves prior to the Civil War, the inaction of fugitive slave laws, and the communal efforts of white Southerners to oppress and murder Black Americans? Tocqueville does not comment on this. He could not comment on the lynchings that would terrorize Black people throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, but an estimated 4,700 lynchings happened in the South between 1882 and 1968. Lynching's terror and evil paints Tocqueville's enterprising townspeople, eager to punish wrongdoing without due process, in a horrific light. How could we praise townships for taking the law into their own hands? There have been many townships throughout the United States history in which de facto segregation, racist town policies, and insidious local associations have oppressed communities of color. My own state of Idaho is one of them. To laud township civic life cannot mean ignoring these things. Again, I think one must emphasize the fact that Tocqueville's township is not an intrinsically good or evil thing. Like any communal entity, whether a nation or a neighborhood, it contains immense capacity for justice and for injustice. It matters how its townspeople are trained and educated, challenged and renewed, whether local townspeople receive the tools, knowledge, and guidance they need to live as kind, compassionate, and responsible citizens. And it matters, whether at the state or the local level, that the needs of the community's vulnerable or marginalized citizens are highlighted, given voice and empowerment. The township matters deeply to Tocqueville not because it is perfect. It matters because it cannot be and never will be benign. The township's potentiality for good and ill means that we must take it seriously, and we should do what we can to support just, safe, and equitable townships, townships in which the virtues that Tocqueville highlights are in fact present. Tocqueville offers readers a frightening warning in the second volume of Democracy in America. He contrasts the active, deliberative life of a U.S. citizen with that of certain European nations at his time, in his lifetime. In some, he writes, the average inhabitant lives thus, quote, the fortune of his village, the policing of his street, the fate of his church and of his presbytery do not touch him. He thinks that all these things do not concern him in any fashion, and that they belong to a powerful foreigner called the government. For himself, he enjoys these goods as a tenant without a spirit of ownership and without ideas of any improvement whatsoever. So the last vital component of Tocqueville's vision of healthy townships is this spirit of ownership. Ultimately, Tocqueville hopes that a citizen will not vote or run for office or otherwise aid their own town simply because they were born there or because they can put local volunteer hours on their resume. Rather, the local citizen should see in the township a free and strong association that he or she is a part of and that is worth their trouble to see to direct. Their attachment to the township stems from its strength, its independence, and the citizen grows interest in it, Tocqueville writes, because they cooperate in directing it. Tocqueville ends this thought by adding, and it's a very striking quote, there is no country in the world where, after all is said and done, men make as many efforts to create social well-being as in the United States. So in conclusion, Wendell Berry has suggested that we love what we particularly know. I think Tocqueville would agree with Berry, because by saying this, Berry is suggesting that love must be more than a general feeling of goodwill. Love is a verb. It is a posture and an attitude that we live out on a day-to-day basis. We love our country, Berry suggests, by loving our community. And we love our community, we might add, by loving our neighbors. Democratic governance starts outside our front door and extends outward as we walk down the sidewalk. It starts not just where we vote, but where we eat breakfast, where we do our laundry, where we worship, where we gather. It proceeds with us to the streets when we protest, and it moves with us to City Hall when we discuss zoning laws. Democratic governance thus grows out of a prudential love for place, one that shapes our mores and grows our virtues. This is not the whole work, but it is, as Tocqueville suggests, the beginning. Thank you.